I'm going to be talking about Sola Scriptura and exactly what that means, and addressing questions about the relationship between Scripture and tradition, how the Lutheran Church has teased out some of those ideas, as well as giving a defense of Sola Scriptura, what exactly we mean by that, why I hold to that particular perspective, because I'm asked questions a lot about why I'm not Eastern Orthodox. For whatever reason, people assume that I would become Eastern Orthodox at some point, and I don't know what the reason is. I suppose it's because because I have an interest in the doctrine of theosis as well as the fathers, and including the Eastern fathers. But I've never really had the temptation myself to just go east. I've never had the temptation really to go to Rome. And I know that there are people who get interested in the church fathers and get interested in liturgy and sacramental theology, and kind of jump into Lutheranism as a stopping point in between their journey really from evangelicalism, which has really no historical roots at all in a lot of ways, kind of like a non-denominational evangelicalism or something like that. And then moving from there, and then they maybe stop at either Lutheranism or Anglicanism kind of on the way. And then where they end up is either in the Eastern or the Roman Church, maybe Anglo-Catholicism. But that's not my journey. I'm not in the middle of some journey to something else. I'm pretty solidly within the Lutheran tradition, and people have asked me, why is that? Why have you not made the journey to the East or the journey to Rome? And there are a number of reasons for that. I do feel that the Lutheran tradition is the best one to be a part of. There's a reason why I am a confessional Lutheran. And people keep asking me to do a 5 reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox video. I probably will do that. No, I definitely will do that, but I'll probably do it soon. There's some difficulties in doing that. Part of the difficulty in doing a 5 reasons I'm not Eastern Orthodox is because the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't make dogmatic statements in the way that Rome does. So it's a lot more difficult to hammer out what the differences are and what the particular disagreements are, because you're talking about general trends. You're not dealing with creedal or confessional statements as you would with a Western church, which does make it really difficult to engage with in the same way that you would engage with, for example, the claims of Rome. So that is a difficulty, but I will do that at some point. So Sola Scriptura, let's just kind of get the groundwork for this. If you guys are interested, I will continue to look at this in various programs. We could spend a long time on this. We could spend a long time looking at particular Roman Catholic arguments, particular texts in the New Testament that speak about tradition, what they mean. We could look at the statements of Trent and go through them piece by piece. We could look at various traditions going through the Church Fathers and looking at what the Fathers said about tradition and how they viewed Scripture and the role that all of these things play with one another. We can do all of that, but this is an introductory program, so I'm going to try to cover what I can here. Just recognize this is not the entirety of the argument. This is not the entirety of the discussion. It's a very complex discussion, one that's taken place over the past 500 years quite extensively, and there are so many resources that we can draw on in dealing with this. But first, let's just kind of start with maybe what does Sola Scriptura mean, and what does that mean for a Protestant? What does that mean for a Lutheran versus what does that mean for someone like a non-denominational evangelical or somebody coming out of the Anabaptist or even Reformed traditions? So Sola Scriptura, I think there's a broad misunderstanding in terms of what that means, and it's not just a misunderstanding. It's also the fact that that phrase is claimed by people of very different traditions who approach tradition itself in a very different way than one another. So for a Lutheran, it means something very different than what it means for an Anabaptist or somebody who's part of the Churches of Christ or something like that. And even for the Reformed, who have a kind of similar view in some ways to the Lutheran tradition, but different in other ways as well. And we're all kind of lumped together and say Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone, and in a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox perspective, when they're looking at Protestantism as a broad whole, they lump all of these different groups together, when in reality, we have very different views in terms of what is the role of tradition, and is there any role of tradition whatsoever? Is tradition an authority at all? And sometimes people have made a distinction between Sola Scriptura and Solo Scriptura. The Latin doesn't make any sense, but that's not the point. The point is, whether you have Scripture by itself, which is Sola Scriptura, as the only authority, or Sola Scriptura, which recognizes there are many authorities, but Scripture is the sole infallible authority. So Scripture has precedence over all other authorities that we might have. It is theonoustos, it is God-breathed, and there are no other authorities that are God-breathed in the way that Scripture is. So that means that there is a uniqueness in terms of the role of Scripture that nothing else can have, whether it's traditions, whether it's councils, whether it's the authorities in the church. And so it's not to say that none of those things have any authority at all, but they're not God-breathed in the sense that Scripture is. So they don't have the same status that Scripture itself has. And so Scripture is the thing that norms everything else. It doesn't mean we can't use councils, doesn't mean we can't use creeds, doesn't mean we can't use the church fathers, but all of those things are to be submitted to Scripture. If there is a disagreement between a council and Scripture, or a church father and Scripture, it is Scripture ultimately that is the higher authority, so that has the ultimate and final say. And so in a more what people call Sola Scriptura sense, which is what you find in the Anabaptist tradition and in traditions that later do arise from that and other modern traditions, especially starting in the 19th century with a lot of these kind of restorationist movements. There's an idea that the primitive church was pure, the church in Acts was pure, and we need to go back to the primitive church and basically just ignore the entirety of the history of the church. We kind of throw all of that out, go back to Acts. And Acts then becomes the model for the church today. And so you're ignoring things like what developed in the church, even in the 2nd century, even within 50 years or so of the death of the apostles, when we do have information about what was going on at the church, that is just thrown out altogether. So that would be the view that you find in Anabaptist groups and others. Now, the Reformed tradition, now the Lutheran and Anglican traditions would be pretty much on the same page here in terms of trying to find a balance between, on the one hand, holding to the unique authority of Scripture that is above all others, while also holding that the tradition and councils and the historic worship of the church, those things are important, and we don't have a right to just throw them out altogether. But recognizing that they have limitations, that they're not God-breathed in the same sense that Scripture is, so they don't have the same kind of authority, of kind of absolute authority that Scripture itself has. Then you have the Reformed tradition. Now, if you talk to people who are in the Reformed tradition, oftentimes they'll say that they basically have the same approach as the Lutheran, and in theory that's partially correct, because they certainly confess creeds and councils, and they see them as having a kind of authority. They certainly use them. They make confessions of faith. Things like the Westminster Confession wouldn't exist if they didn't believe that there can be any secondary sources of authority at all. So in that sense, there is some agreement. But even so, I think there is a difference, and you see that difference in terms of how things are played out, for example, in the Confessions of Faith. So the Westminster Confession, as its authority for the various statements that are made, and part of this is the context of the Westminster too, in that it is historically much later, and what's going on there. But in the Westminster Confession, you have various doctrinal statements, and then you have scriptural proof texts on the bottom, which prove those doctrines to be correct, and it's solely taken from Scripture. Now, the Lutheran confessions are a little different in that if you read through the Book of Concord, it consistently cites both Scripture and the Church Fathers. So it might be the case theoretically that they do approach tradition in the same way in some sense. In practical, just the way it works itself out, it is certainly the case that the Lutheran tradition has a much more robust use of the fathers in even its confessional statements. Now, that doesn't mean that if you do read the Reformed scholastics, and even if you read Calvin, there is a strong use of the fathers. They do use the fathers, they do use the councils, but particularly where this difference shows up the most is in terms of worship and church government. So if you look at the worship of the Reformed Church, as compared to the worship of the Lutheran or Anglican traditions. The Lutheran or Anglican traditions basically said, we're going to remain consistent with how the church has been worshiping and how these things have developed, but what we're going to do is use Scripture as that ultimate authority that does need to judge the other authorities. And so, in light of that, we take our traditions and the liturgy as it's developed in the Western Church, and we judge it by Scripture. So, if there are things that are inconsistent with Scripture or harmful to things that are taught in Scripture, we get rid of those things while retaining the tradition itself. The Reformed Church simply didn't do that. If you look at Calvin's liturgies and you look at what Zwingli was doing in worship, at first he just got rid of music altogether. There really is a very different understanding of consistency. And the idea, especially if you look at something like the regulative principle of worship, that we can throw out tradition and solely go by Scripture in terms of the functioning of the church, the government of the church. And you do have, in some sense, a kind of restorationist view of how the early church functioned. And why I say that is because as you get into the second century, we do have episcopal polity that shows up basically immediately. And I think if you read Ignatius, he's very clearly talking about bishops who have an authority over pastors. They're not simply congregational pastors. He doesn't mention one in Rome, which I do think is significant for the claims of the Roman Catholic Church in terms of the papacy. But what I think is very clear is that episcopacy develops basically immediately. And the early fathers who knew the apostles don't see any opposition between the episcopacy and what the church structure was in the New Testament. So in the Reformed Church, in some sense, you are going back to a kind of restorationist view, especially of church government and of worship. And it is the idea, I mean, it inherently has to be, because of the resources that we have in terms of both episcopal polity as well as the worship of the early church. It has to be for non-liturgical Protestants there is a kind of restorationism in that the church fell away from pure worship in basically the second century, immediately after the death of the apostles. So while they might not say that's true doctrinally, in terms of worship, it kind of has to be, in some sense at least. So there is where I think practically you see a difference, whereas the Lutheran tradition says, no, we can hold to, for example, the episcopal offices. That is an authority. And we can hold to the way that the church has structured itself historically. That is an authority, but that authority has to be subsumed under the greater authority, which is Scripture, which is why we can then say, well, insofar as that has been abused or has hindered the preaching or proper proclamation and teaching of Scripture, then we can change those elements. I still personally think episcopal polity is probably the best. It's the one the church has used historically. A lot of Lutherans still use it. It's kind of more than anything else circumstantial that the episcopal offices were not used in the Lutheran Church in Germany in the 16th century. It certainly is the assumption, if you read through our confessions, that is going to be the polity of the church. But it's not a divinely instituted authority in that God did not say the church has to run this way or has to function this way, but it is what the church has done, so we had no reason to throw it out. So I think that does demonstrate to you that there is a difference between the way that the Lutheran tradition and the way that the Reformed tradition view authority. There simply is a difference, whether you want to say that there is or not, or understand what that is or not. So while theoretically it might sound similar, theoretically, yes, we both use creeds, we both use confessions, we both use the church fathers. There are areas of overlap. There is a difference between the Reformed on the one hand and then the Lutheran on the other, while neither of us are giving tradition this kind of ultimate authority that supersedes Scripture or is on an equal level with Scripture itself.